droughts, floods, fires were very much part of my childhood. And so resilience really was something that we lived every day. It was a doing word. It wasn't something we talked about. It was something that we factored into our everyday lives. I grew up with a very strong sense and purpose, I guess, in wanting to add value in everything I did. Wanting to achieve outcomes, wanting to get things done, wanting to be able to have that job satisfaction. And looking back, we have seen food insecurity in Australia and in Queensland increase quite significantly again post-COVID. Cost of living, the cost of accessing affordable food is really starting to impact on a lot of families.
We will draw from the current source. If you draw from current source of power and water, who will get less? And how do you decide that?
I think if you're a business that's not engaging and utilising AI and automation, you are falling behind.
One observation is people who don't have purpose in their life, they try to find, or they're finding their purpose.
I think if you can identify a why for today, you know, what are you really wanting to achieve from today? What are you wanting to give today?
Before we get started, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode of our cutting-edge contemporary conversations. Thank you.
Welcome, Jo Sheppard. How are you?
Very well. Lovely to be here.
Thank you for your time today, and I thank you for saying yes to be involved in this celebration event on the Women's Day next year.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. Next year I'll be here before we know it.
Yes, and I was very intrigued with your background and experience as I was reading through your bio, but would love for you to share a bit more of your story, and then you're landing into being the CEO of the Peak Body.
So I grew up on a sheep and cattle property in far southwest Queensland, 80 kilometres out of Cunnamulla, so in quite a remote area. I grew up on our family property with my two brothers, so was very involved in the ag sector from all of my life, very involved in the family property. Was quite competitive as a young child, wanted to be able to do everything that my brothers could do on the property. So it was really active part of the business from a very young age. We were quite isolated back then in terms of lack of technology, and I don't think we got TV until we were about 16 or 17. But we did School of the Air and distance education for all of our primary school, and then we all went to boarding school in Sydney from the age of 12 and came home every holidays to do work on the property, work on the family farm. So I think those early days growing up on a property, being very involved, but being very hands-on, being very practical, really set the scene for me later in life and in my professional career. Ending up being the CEO of the Queensland Farmers Federation. Most people say that's such a natural fit for me because I have been around agriculture all of my life. When I was quite young, I was elected to local council out in Paria Shire, Cunnamulla, my hometown, and I was on council for 12 years, 4 of which I was mayor. So that's probably when I started to get involved in advocacy
and policy.
And I really enjoyed, going down to Canberra and representing my community and getting wins for the community. I found that really satisfying. Being around ag, being involved in advocacy, perfect fit then, I think, to become the CEO of the Queensland Farmers Federation.
Very powerful. Growing up on a farm, what kind of work ethic you build up? What are the values you've lived by, and what have been ingrained through doing things rather than talking about things?
Every Christmas I used to say to Dad, or still do, I blame him for my very strong work ethic because I do have a very strong work ethic. I just find it difficult to let things go before they're finished, which is sometimes a really positive thing, and sometimes you need to really draw a line in the sand. But growing up on a family property, you do develop strong work ethic. You're part of a working family, you're all working alongside of each other. On a property like that, it's your home, but it's also your business. There's always things that need to be done. But I remember as a child, Mum would be quite firm around, having a Sunday roast. So we'd have a roast on Sunday and then try and have the Sunday afternoon off, because the very real risk is that you work most of the time. I think the other values are very much family. So, whilst we didn't spend, a lot of time going on family holidays, we'd sort of have one family holiday to the coast every year, but we spent a lot of time working and living on the property together as a family. Because we were so isolated, you relied on each other. So if there's, a drama out in the paddock, or you got a flat tyre or broke down, you either had to help yourself in terms of, being quite resilient and being able to respond, or you relied on your family. Very strong work ethic, but also very strong family values. But some of the other values I think are around being useful and being productive, and enjoying seeing the fruits of your labour. So you could work hard for a day and look back, and you can actually see where you've been and what you've achieved. So I grew up with a very strong sense and purpose, I guess, in wanting to add value in everything I did, wanting to achieve outcomes, wanting to get things done, wanting to be able to have that job satisfaction of looking back and seeing what you've done individually, but also what you've done as a small family unit, a small team. Hard work, but also a constructive, productive mindset around progress and moving forward and getting outcomes. The other thing I would say, droughts, floods, fires were very much part of my childhood. So resilience really was something that we lived every day. It was a doing word. It wasn't something we talked about. It was something that we factored into our everyday lives. We, knew that we had to prepare for and, cope with sometimes very extended droughts. I think the longest one I remember was about 10 years. It was a 10-year drought, which was actually quite a long time. So as young people, my brothers and I, watched how mum and dad cope with that, and we sort of adapted as well. So I think growing up on the property and being, actively involved in a resilient environment has also been really useful for me later in life.
I think the act of doing rather than being productive, that's a very good way to define yourself, that being productive, being useful, because you can't sit and do nothing, you have to be doing something, and that's a very powerful leadership style as well, which you would probably bring in your role these days. And sometimes you don't value the act, being productive as a default, as a primary virtue. What do you see that as?
So I think because that's how I was brought up, and it was very much ingrained in me from a very young age that, running a family business, we had tasks that had to be done, and most times, it was us who had to do them. So you very much grew up with that sense of, if not you,
you can't take a sickie.
You couldn't take a sickie. You rarely took a sickie. You were very sick if you were taking a sickie. But we grew up with that concept of, if something had to be done, if not you, then who? Because it was, you were there, and you were there with your family, and you, had to find solutions and get the job done. And sometimes, when you're in a very busy production period on the farm, as little kids, we would sort of dread it. We'd go, oh my God, we've got to get those sheep so far from the back paddock all the way into the shearing shed, or you'd be drafting thousands of sheep, and you'd look back down the sheep yards, and all you could see was sheep, and you'd think, oh, this is never going to be done. But so I guess that persistence and resilience and sticking at it was very much something that we lived as a family as well. So yeah, I think it's a one of the values that I appreciate most, having been instilled in me as a child, because certainly later in years in my professional career, I've remained very outcome focused. So I've learned how to use systems and strategies to help, move businesses and ideas and, policy concepts forward. But I have remained at the core someone who actually wants to get on the ground achievements, which I think is really important when you're working for a sector like agriculture.
There's a so-called divide between regional Australians versus city or metro living Australians. I think that divide created through the political class, which has to divide people and create their politics, or is it, hard and real?
Oh, I think the divide is very real, but I think some of it is due to geography. So Australia is a very big land mass, and I think there's as we become more centralised, our population is growing. in the capital cities. There's less and less people who have a real connection to farming, as the face of agriculture has also changed somewhat over the years. Back my parents, used to always talk to about back in their day. The cities, people in the city had an uncle, or they had an aunt, or they had cousins who were on the farm somewhere in rural Australia, and they would go out there for school holidays. Whereas I think we're seeing, that divide in many ways, widen in spite of better communications, social media, television, all of those things that you would hope would connect us more closely. I do think the gap is widening, but I think that's a challenge that as a sector we need to take on. I think I don't think it's so much around political classes, but really, the way in which the population is dispersed across Australia. We are very centralised. We have, cities. I mean, if you look at Brisbane, Greater Brisbane, they're saying is going to be the same as Greater Sydney by 2040. That's a massive urban sprawl. So I think, the divide is more related to that than anything else.
From an agriculture point of view, what are the bigger issues or challenges the state of Queensland is facing? And then we can talk broadly about Australia, but if you can be specific to Queensland in terms of bigger challenges from an ag point of view.
Yeah, I think agriculture is interesting. People see ag as a sector and don't think about the nuances. But at the Queensland Farmers Federation, we represent peak bodies, so the different commodity groups. And over the years that I've been with the organisation, it's been great because I've got to know each commodity group, really well. And there are some differences. There's a lot of things that are the same, but the agriculture sector is actually quite complex. And there are differences, depending on if you're in intensive production or grazing production, whether you're a cotton farmer or if you're a horticulture production farmer. There are nuances, but I would say more broadly, the terms of trade, cost of production has increased, on average between 50 and 60% across most farms in Queensland post-COVID. And certainly for a sector like horticulture, which is, traditionally getting the same price for their produce from the supermarkets and their markets, as they were 9 or 10 years ago, that terms of trade and the margins really start to squeeze. We've also, seen workforce shortages, which we are still challenged by. And if you listen to a lot of the demographers, that challenge is likely to stay for at least another 10, 15 years. So again, for those parts of agriculture that are heavily reliant on workforce, and again, horticulture is a great example. So they're heavily reliant on large numbers of workers, particularly during certain parts of their season. That's really started to impact as well. But we are also seeing in Queensland an interesting situation evolve in that demand for land in Queensland's really increasing. Some of the southern states have already experienced this, but this is really ramping up for us in Queensland. So we're seeing changing land use across the state, and you're seeing farmers who, depending on what region they're in, actually having a lot of options in terms of what they can do with their land. We're seeing all the way up the eastern seaboard of Queensland, a lot of farms, typically cane farms, horticulture farms, dairy farms in some instances being gobbled up and turned into suburbs. So yes, it does point to something as consumers we all should be alive to, because we've been quite lucky in Australia in relation to food security, but I think with the demand for land as it is and other factors, I think we really need to start valuing that from our perspective, but also for the future generations. But for Queensland, the other thing that has been impacting a lot in recent years are weather events. So Queensland is, Australia's most impacted state when it comes to extreme weather events. So in the last, little while, we have been seeing, particularly some regions, really impacted by severe storm seasons, flooding episodes, year on year. So we're seeing some farming enterprises really suffer from that cumulative impact where, sort of every summer you're impacted by a significant weather event. So, that's been challenging as well. So lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities for Queensland and Australian agriculture as well. We have such a strong reputation. I think ABARES released a report a couple of years ago around Australian farmers and how we rank in terms of ESG credentials globally, and we are right up there. It's something we should be really proud of. So, the world really wants our product. So demand for our product remains strong. So there's, a lot of opportunity as well.
I have a bit of a overarching, is food security a matter of national security or national resilience? How do you see, because it's a different perspective when you see that as a national security matter, the whole both perspective changes, but if you see that as just one of the sectors, then it's a different perspective. So how do you see food security as?
I think food security should be seen as a significant part of national security. And I think certainly for my generation, we've not experienced ever any difficulty in terms of accessing, affordable, nutritious food. But we have seen food insecurity in Australia and in Queensland increase quite significantly again post-COVID. The cost of living, the cost of accessing affordable food is really starting to impact on a lot of families. So I think from an individual consumer family perspective, it's real, but from a national security perspective, it's also real. And the federal government's currently, doing a food security, national security type strategy, which we're being involved in. But I think, there's key things that feed into food security. So certainly we've already touched on, land use planning and making sure that we, retain our really critical food producing regions. But there's also things like, national freight and transport strategies that need to be heavily invested in over a long period of time, so that we can actually move produce around, not only Queensland but also Australia. Fuel security, workforce security. There's a whole range of things that sort of all underpin food security. But to answer your question, absolutely, food security is a really critical part of national security. I think here in Queensland, if you look at some regions that are absolute powerhouses when it comes to food production, the Lockyer Valley is a prime example. I think it produces approximately 40% of what you and I eat in terms of fresh fruit and vegetables. And I drive through that region every week. I live in Toowoomba, drive down to Brisbane every week, and I see the massive explosion of housing and suburbs that are springing up everywhere throughout that region. And when I hear the statistics around Brisbane, Greater Brisbane being like Greater Sydney by 2040, that does concern me, because I think where if a lot of that region is actually going to be a suburbia, what happens to the food production that we've been relying on from that region.
And the other argument is if that suburb, Greater Brisbane is much bigger as Greater Sydney, you need to produce more food as well.
Yeah,
so that also, is that conversation happening?
Yes, so I think all the global stats are pointing to the fact that we need to produce more food. And I think Australia is one of the most advanced countries in terms of technology innovation, because our farmers aren't subsidised. Farmers in many areas in other parts of the world are heavily subsidised, so Australian farmers have had to be really innovative. So I think that has been taking place here in Australia for many, many years. But I think what we need to be more aware of here in Australia is that we can't be complacent around food and fibre and foliage production anymore like we have been. My father, who's 93, can remember coupons and rations, and when you would literally catch a rabbit and eat it for dinner for the family. But my generation, and certainly my kids' generation, haven't had to experience that. So we have become quite complacent, to the point where people, when I do raise the issue of food security, people push back quite strongly. They say, no, Jo, we can't. We export over 80% of what we grow. But then when you dig past the stats and you actually look at those food producing regions, so using the Lockyer Valley as an example, and the changing land use that's taking place, then and you think about fresh food, so fruit and vegetables, dairy, rather than the bigger commodity products that we do export, then people start to think, actually, we do need to be more aware of this, and we do need to start prioritising food production, not just as a valuable export market, which is what it is, and agriculture across food, fibre and foliage, has contributed to our export markets for a long time, but fresh food, so that, in years to come, our children can enjoy affordable, accessible Australian fruit, veggies, dairy products, just like we have.
What's the overlap between federal and state politics in terms of their views, how they see the sector very differently or very similarly?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have in Australia is from a legislative perspective. We have a whole range of federal legislation, then the states have their own legislation as well, and sometimes it becomes very confusing as to which legislation applies. So if we look currently at the EPBC Act review, which is underway, and that's federal legislation, very important to a whole range of things, including food security. But in my view, that legislation is only ever going to work well if all the states are at the table. Whilst ever, the states sit back and go, well, that's the EPBC, that's federal legislation, which applies, that way, whereas our legislation applies this way, it's going to be disjointed and it's going to be difficult. So I think it is a challenge. Sometimes we do find, alignment, irrespective of who's in government and what colour of politics they're in. But I do feel there's many examples where, federal legislation versus state legislation is clunky and not working as well as it possibly should be or could be.
And then how do you coordinate that public policy work? Because every state has different state legislations and their own intricacies because they produce different things across all states and territories. So how do you bring them together and then compare with the federal, and how do you do that 1 to 8 kind of a comparison?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate that the state is able to have legislation and take lead on some of the things that are happening in their state. I think it's really important that state governments work with the communities to prioritise their priorities for their future of their state. For instance, in Queensland, things like water, energy, really important for Queensland, and the Queensland government's taking a lead role in that, which I think is, can be very, very appropriate. And I wouldn't like to suggest that, states start to defer to federal legislation, from a holistic perspective, because I don't think that would be, entirely appropriate. But I do think there needs to be a greater coordination piece between states with each other, as in individual states, particularly on... Is
that the role of the National Farmers Federation to bring all together, or is it working?
For agriculture?
Yeah,
certainly the National Farmers Federation plays a key role, so they
bring perspectives from across all states.
So Queensland Farmers Federation is a member of the National Farmers Federation, as are the other state ag bodies. Which is really useful because it's a good forum where we can compare, different key policy areas between the states, but also feed into policy work at that national level. But I think from an intergovernment perspective, we've got a lot of work to do. There are forums that bring together, for instance, the water
National Cabinet. Is there a National Cabinet on the agriculture process?
Yes, and water and energy and other things that matter to agriculture. So I think that's a really good positive step. But I think we are highly legislated in Australia, so I think we've got some work to do in terms of perhaps streamlining some of the legislation.
Can I throw another spanner in the works of another challenge you might foresee in the future? As Australia takes on the adoption of AI in any way or form, as you know, AI requires a lot of power, and when you run in large data centers, you need water. So there are two conversations to be had: that are we producing energy on surplus? Do we have extra energy in the system across all states to be used through these computational large data centers? For example, in US, what US has done is they have turned on closed power plants to be given to Microsoft so that they can draw an energy from those sources, so that it's not impacting the consumer grade or regional power and water both. Water is a different conversation, but yes, for power, that's what they're doing. But I think that conversation has to be had in Australia as well. If you don't produce energy in surplus, are we thinking of increasing our energy production? Because if we want to be a part of that AI conversation in the future, if you don't do that conversation of extra power production, we will draw from the current source. And if you draw from current source of power and water, who will get less? And how do you decide that?
So I think a couple of things in there. So I think, you know, if you're a business that's not engaging and utilising AI and automation, you are falling behind. So I think, you know, it's incredibly important that Australia utilises AI to the best of its ability to leverage the opportunities there. There's a lot of risks as well, so they need to be managed. But in relation to energy, there's no doubt that we need more energy. And actually our Queensland government's just released the energy roadmap, and very much the Energy Minister was talking about the fact that we need more. So we need more gas, we need to extend the life of coal, we need to incorporate renewable energy. So all sources of energy, we need more. But I think, you know, the evolution of the Queensland energy grid is going to be interesting over the sort of next 10 to 20 years. We've got new technology, you know, new ways of producing energy. So we're seeing farmers across Queensland you know, utilise new ways of producing energy on farms. So we're seeing, you know, solar. A lot of farmers who are investing in solar on farm have over-invested, so they actually have excess energy. But at this point, there's not much they can do with that excess energy. It's not overly viable. Not overly viable to be, you know, putting it back into the grid. But there's an enormous opportunity, you know, in the future around distributed energy, microgrids. You know, peer-to-peer trading, so that farmers who have excess energy actually can trade it off across their own accounts, or they can trade it with their neighbour, or potentially you could trade it across your whole community. So I think there's an enormous opportunity around the future in relation to distributed energy. But I think we will see the energy grid, or our energy system, I should say, you know, it won't look like it does today in 10, 20 years' time. But certainly we're going to need more energy, but I think we utilise technology and do some really good strategic work around making sure that what we are doing when it comes to producing more energy actually strengthens the grid and doesn't undermine the grid. So there's early work, you know, going on in that space, but I think we're going to see a lot more opportunities and a lot more strategic work needing to be done as the system keeps evolving.
And the similar conversation is happening around the water side of it as well?
Yeah, water. So water, you know, water security, water efficiency have always been really important in Queensland and Australia. We are, you know, a dry continent. So individual farmers and agriculture as a sector has done amazing work in relation to water efficiency over the last 10, 20 years. If you look at the cotton industry, just as one example, you know, they're producing double what they used to produce for the same amount of water as, you know, they were 20 years ago. So that on-farm water efficiency, but, you know, whole community water efficiency work needs to continue and to be something that we chip away at forever, I think. But from a statewide and a national perspective, there's a lot of work we can do in terms of making existing water systems more efficient. And of course then, you know, there's the significant water infrastructure that's needed as well. But yeah, water and energy are absolutely critical to not only to communities but to the future of our economy. And you know, in agriculture they go hand in hand. Farmers will often talk about the nexus, you know, between water and energy. Yeah, both really important.
Is there any work done on the resilience of, because there's a lot of climate events, as you talked about, Queensland is impacted highly with, and how do we make the state more resilient? So what is there a strategy around it? Is it people are talking of planning beforehand, and how do you manage an ongoing climate events? How do you prepare for it, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so climate events aren't new to us here in Queensland. As I said, you know, growing up on our property, I remember, you know, the 10-year droughts to the record floods. fire seasons, hailstorms. But Queensland is one of Australia's, or probably Australia's, most impacted state when it comes to climate events. We have seen in the last 10 to 20 years farmers, communities, governments really do better when it comes to preparedness. Not just response, but actually how we can build resilience in between times. So there's been an awful lot of work done over the last, I would say, 2 decades. We've actually had some recent reforms this year with the Queensland government in terms of including crop replacement as part of the response, but also expanding the definition of primary producer. But we are seeing, an expansion of preparedness, and also sharing experiences. So sharing, what you did on your farm or in your community that might have worked, etc. Over the years, we've seen local governments, councils invest significantly in infrastructure, whether it might be, levee banks or other key infrastructure. We're also seeing some projects now, or some communities look at, nature solutions, to help with flood and weather resilience as well. So there's a whole range of planning, preparedness work going on, as well as, constant reviews on what we can improve from a response perspective. But, again, I think that's going to be work that we just never finish doing, because the more that we learn, the more experience we have, the more innovations we can apply. And there's still significant work to be done. One of the challenges, which is becoming, very real for farmers, but also for communities, is around insurance. So we've seen, insurance premiums in some cases go up 3 or 4 times, sort of in the last sort of 7, 8, 9 years. In some regions, farmers and residents are now finding that they can't afford insurance, or insurance is actually just not accessible. So I think that's a really serious conversation that we're going to have as a community, and with government involved, because I think it's a very different scenario.
Would government underwrite parts of the project, parts of the climate events? No.
But I think when we're seeing, insurers become very reluctant to provide insurance for some regions, then there very much may need to be a role for government to step in. Because I think, if we do move to a scenario where businesses and residents are taking on 100% of their own risk, that changes dynamics significantly. So I think the insurance space is something that we need to watch. There's a lot of research that's been done around parametric insurance, ways that industry can work more closely with insurance providers, so that you can sort of tailor insurance products to that which a farmer or a business needs, rather than, just having the off-the-shelf products. So I think there's a lot of work that's already been underway, but I think that's certainly a space for us all to watch.
I want to switch gears on your leadership style. Could you talk more on, how has the leadership style of yours has evolved, and through experience, and what do you value more versus other things, probably in the early part of your career?
So I think my leadership style is very much about leading by doing, based on my experiences when I grew up on the farm.
To be productive.
To be productive, but to also work with boards and with teams and with stakeholders around being clear on your purpose. So I think I learnt that on the days of the farm as well, because if you aren't clear on your why or your purpose, then sometimes you can be awfully productive and busy, but going down a path that you didn't really want to be on. So I think my leadership style is around being really clear on the why, and really clear on the purpose, and then formulating strategies and action plans, boards, teams, the whole organisation, because everyone plays a role. I think that's the other thing I learned at a very young age, is that I think leadership is very much about taking your role in the team. So leadership isn't necessarily about being the person out the front, but leadership really is about owning and taking responsibility for your part in the team. So everyone actually plays a leadership role as part of a team dynamic. So I learnt that on the farm, because even though mum and dad were often the leaders, my brothers and I had really important roles to play. So we were leaders in the part that we played. So I've carried that on to my leadership style in my professional life. So I think, one person's not a leader. I think teams are leaders, and everyone has their role. So I think it's really important to be clear on your why, know where you're trying to get to, have tangible plans in place where everyone knows their role. So then, hopefully you get a situation where you're all working on the same page and for a common goal. And I think that's when you can really get some strong outcomes.
So how are you entertaining yourself as a 16-year-old before the telly came to your house? You and your brothers, how would you entertain yourself?
I don't think we thought about entertainment. So I remember, if we ever said...
No music, no ballet.
Oh yes, we had some, CD players that we used to listen to music, but if I remember if we told Mum we were bored, she would find jobs, clean the silver or clean the furniture. So we learned very quickly that
Not to say
we were
that
never
word.
bored.
Never
So we
bored.
found our own entertainment, but I enjoyed horse riding. So I used to go for long horse riders, go to pony club, do some show jumping. So we did that. One of my brothers was very into motocross racing. So we did those types of sports. We'd go to the dam and catch yabbies. So we did. It was very much an outdoor lifestyle. I'd often ride my horse down to one of the river paddocks, and go for a swim in the creek, and then tie the horse up for a while, and then rest in the shade, and then you'd ride back. So it was a very, very outdoor existence, but we were never bored.
Lovely. In conclusion, if you can talk a bit more, you talked about you need to have your why, your purpose, and one observation is people who don't have purpose in their life, they just they try to find, or they're finding their purpose. So, and then having a purpose and finding a purpose, they're two parts of the play. And how do you see people who are struggling to find a purpose, what they should be thinking and wondering about?
Yeah, I think you grow up sometimes and you do these leadership courses or go to these seminars, and they talk about finding your purpose and finding your why. And sometimes I think it's not that clear to all of us what our life purpose is. I know certainly for me, I never had a clear goal around what I wanted to do career-wise. I never planned on being the mayor of a council. But what I did do was open myself up to opportunities and always focused on wherever I was, adding the most value I could. So again, the doing piece. And sometimes I think your why, you can do that day by day. Sometimes if you can't see a really strong why, for 5 or 10 years ahead, I think if you can identify a why for today, what are you really wanting to achieve from today? What are you wanting to give today? I think, day by day is a really great place to start. I know sometimes when I get incredibly busy, and I've said this to my team, I will literally work day to day. So I'll focus on what I need to get done today and do the best that I can, and then again the next day, and then eventually all of those days add up to a wonderful life. And like I think Steve Jobs said in his book, the dots do all join up, but sometimes you don't know until you look backwards.
Yeah. Thank you, Jo.
My pleasure.